slash scripture in Deuteronomy 22:11 that talks about the different types of linen that we could not wear. It tell you in Deuteronomy 22:11, and it makes it clear. It says, "Thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts." That means different materials, as of woolen and linen together. Again, you can go through this whole chapter in Deuteronomy 22, and there's no judgment for death. So there's no judgment for death for the clothing, and there's no judgment of death for the food. But to get that out of the way, let's go into the new.
If I just may interject, and I really would prefer if you would do justice to your listeners and explain to them, one, context behind Scripture, two, cultural context, because you said something just now that adultery was not one of those things that you could be killed for, one of those sins.
No, adultery was death, brother. Adultery was death.
And one of the things that you ought to understand, that within the Hebrew or Jewish culture, that transgressions were punishable by death, no matter what the transgressions were. And we can see that throughout particular portions of this Old Testament. We see that with Achan. Achan committed none of what you term the so-called abominable acts. All Achan did not follow instruction, yet he was commanded to be put to death. Transgressions were punishable by death, especially transgressions that were publicly found out, to set an example for the rest of this nomadic people that they must walk in obedience.
Well,
whatever transgression was publicly found out. And you have to go back into historical context. You cannot just read Scripture at face value and make application. You spoke for a long while and I listened. You spoke for a very long while.
Brother, I'm dealing with
and I listened.
Scripture.
And you cannot apply Scripture without context. You have to go back into the historical context. When we talk about a biblical hermeneutic, we do not talk about a biblical hermeneutic that just depends on us to read at face value and to say things. We have to go back into one original language. And it might interest you that during the time, the word abomination never even existed. Have you read Hebrew text? One. Two, you have to go back into the historical and cultural setting. And those things will help you to understand the Scripture that you read. And I think perhaps we would never agree here, because our hermeneutic is different. You read and you hold to a literal interpretation for your hermeneutic, and I don't.
Well, brother, see, that's where the confusion comes in. The confusion
There's no confusion.
No, let me make it clear. The confusion is Christ says, "Believe on me as the Scripture have said," not one's interpretation of the Scripture. Now, you've made two statements which have been founded in Scripture to be incorrect. It's okay to be incorrect. Let me make this clear. In the Old Testament, each year, there was a day called the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement, once a year, the Hebrews had to bring a certain sacrifice for the sins they did that was not unto death. If every sin one did was punishable by death, there would be no people in the earth today. There were sins in which that wasn't unto death, that we would go for the Day of Atonement to get those sins atoned. You have to be living to get your sins
That is
atoned on
not
the day of
true.
atonement each year.
That is not true, and you have
want me to read that too?
purposely left out. That is not true, and you have purposely left out what I've said, that the Day of Atonement offered sacrifice for sins that were committed that were not public. Public transgression was punishable by law.
Okay, well, do me a favor, brother.
Whatever that transgression was.
Brother, do me a favor now, because
was.
I'm going to be quiet. Listen, brother. I need you to show me according to Scripture. Your interpretation, whatever it is. Show me according to Scripture.
Interpretation.
Listen what I'm asking
tell me
you.
About the history. Tell me about the history. Tell me of the history. Because the Old Testament was not written to you, and it was not written in Western culture.
Brother, I'm asking you to show me out of Scripture the homosexual lifestyle being excused according to the Bible.
You continue to do this. This is what you continue to do. You spoke for 20 minutes without interruption from me, and you are going to allow me to speak.
Yes, brother, but what we're trying to do is become... This is a Bible study.
Are you going to allow me to present my case? You spoke for 20 minutes without an interruption. Allow me. Because if you're not going to allow me, then this discussion makes no sense. Allow me to present my case.
Brother, I will allow you, but what I'm asking you to do, can you please
allow me? Okay. All right, go ahead, talk.
I'm just asking you, brother. When you
go ahead and talk. I have nothing left to say because you won't allow me to speak.
Brother, I will allow you to speak. What I'm asking you to do, just for the listeners.
I don't have to speak on your conditions. Allow me to speak.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We will allow you to speak, but please use some scriptures in the meantime with it. Is that okay? Is that okay? And I'll be totally quiet, but please give us some scriptural context within your whatever you're bringing. Is that all right?
Like I was saying, when we approach Scripture, the Old Testament, which was not written in West culture, was not written in our time. To understand the context of the Scripture and to be able to make application, we have to take into consideration the cultural and historical background to the text. What is being written in the Old Testament is not happening in a vacuum. Now, having set context to how the Hebrew people or the Jewish people operated under the law, under the Levitical codes, we are better able to understand what the Scriptures are saying to us. All transgressions that were made public, all transgressions. And if the Bible cannot stand the test of historicity, then the Bible ought not to be any credible foundation for discussion or for faith or for instruction. All transgressions that were made public were punishable by death. If any of those persons who had eye defects, for example, or leprosy, for example, dared to enter into the tabernacle, if they dared, they were put to death for having transgressed. If anybody dared to break the Sabbath, they were put to death. And you can check your history out. History is verifiable. They were put to death for having transgressed. And your Jesus, the Jesus that we preach about, the Jesus that we worship, It was for the same reason he couldn't minister where he grew up. It was for the same reason they sought him to kill him, because he broke Sabbath, because he disrupted the law. Did he sleep with any man? He do not have the records. Did he commit adultery? They sought to kill him because he disrupted the codes. The Day of Atonement offered forgiveness for those sins that were not unearthed. And even in that very penal situation, grace, mercy, and forgiveness were offered. In fact, the biblical irony is that, as much as fundamentalist Christians have us to believe, no matter how many biblical scholars you have who have mistakenly gone over the Leviticus holiness codes that you would find from Leviticus 18 to 20, nor the Sodom and Gomorrah argument in Genesis 19, nor Romans chapter 1, can present a compelling case based on the grammatical structure of the language against what you're saying.
If you don't mind me asking, okay, obviously we're talking about these other sins in the Old Testament. Let's get to the premise of our phone call. Do you believe that homosexuality is one of those sins? According to the Bible. Do you believe that homosexuality was one of those sins that was a sin unto death in the Old Testament?
No, I don't. There's no credible scripture based on grammatical and historical context that would prove that.
If man lie with mankind as he lieth with the woman, they shall surely be put to death. That's not a more proper context for you? That's not good enough for you?
No, that's not. It's not.
Okay, what would you need the Bible to say to disagree with homosexuality? What context would be good for you to read and say, okay, this is bad, this is good? And I'm saying this is because if we are to look at the Bible and say, well, even though the Bible's saying this, it's not saying this, what's right? People can do anything they want, I suppose.
Your responsibility as a minister, sir, your responsibility as a minister is to always go behind the text. Your responsibility as a minister is to understand how meanings and nuances can be lost in translation, and you go back to original translation. That is your responsibility as a minister. You ought not to be lazy and read to me an English word that has been written thousands of years after the fact, whose language is not as dynamic, and make interpretations based on that. That is your responsibility. Within those same biblical codes, and that's why I said earlier, I made the point earlier, that as we read the Bible, we have to understand how the Bible rereads itself and how the Bible progresses in its own revelation. Those are the same Levitical codes that make slavery okay. Those are the same codes that discriminate against disabilities. How do we reread that? How do we reconcile with that? And what are the principles that are being taught from those codes that seem draconian? So certainly if we hold to your very literal and rigidly absolute interpretation and reading of it, then we must hold to the absolute rigid interpretation of it right through. We cannot find wiggle way for the things that we don't agree with and the things that we no longer like. So we wiggle our way out of slavery, and we wiggle our way out of discrimination against disabilities, and we wiggle our way